In 1933, a widow in Boone County, Iowa, fed herself and two grandchildren for an entire week on 60 cents. No meat touched that kitchen. No bread either, most days. What kept three people alive was a single sack of potatoes and a kind of knowledge that bordered on instinct. That knowledge has a name now. People call it survival cooking. Back then, they just called it Tuesday. This is not a list about being poor. It is a list about being smart with nothing, which somehow worked better than being rich with everything. Number 23 turns one potato into 4 separate meals. Number 5 got banned from a government cookbook for being, in the words of one nutritionist, too plain to print. Subscribe now, because knowledge like this skips a generation fast if nobody writes it down. Let us start at 25. Number 25. Potato and tomato can stew. A can of tomatoes, a few cut potatoes, simmered together until the broth turns thick and faintly sweet. This is the kind of dinner that came from a pantry shelf rather than a grocery trip, built around whatever sat in the cupboard on a night nobody felt like spending anything extra. The acid in the tomato breaks the potato down just enough to thicken the whole pot without a drop of cream. Steam rising off this stew carries a smell halfway between a garden and a kitchen, warm and a little tangy. Families stretching one trip to the store across 2 weeks leaned on a can of tomatoes constantly because it turned plain potatoes into something that tasted like it took effort. It never took much effort at all. It just took knowing what 2 cheap things could do together. Number 24. Potato peel broth. Save every peel. Do not rinse them down the drain. Boil them low and slow with an onion skin and a bay leaf if you have one. And you get a broth that tastes like something simmered all day, because in a way it did. Farmhouse kitchens across the Midwest ran on this. Nothing with a root or a skin went in the trash, because trash was a luxury nobody could afford. The smell alone fills a kitchen the way bone broth does, but it costs you nothing you were not already throwing away. Today we peel potatoes and bin the peels without a second thought. That is not modern convenience. That is just waste wearing a nicer outfit. This one is for anyone tired of watching good food disappear into a garbage can for no reason at all. Number 23. The one pan. Potato and egg skillet. 1 potato, sliced thin. 1 egg, maybe 2 if the week was kind. A hot pan and bacon grease saved in a jar by the stove. That is the whole meal, and for a senior cooking alone tonight, it still is. Crisp the potatoes first, low heat, patience instead of butter. Crack the egg right on top when the edges turn gold. The sound of it hitting that hot fat is half the reason this dish still works on tired nights. 1 pan, 1 dish to wash. No reason to cook a feast for an audience of 1. Your grandmother understood that loneliness does not need to mean a complicated dinner, and she was right. Number 13 on this list takes that same 1 potato even further. Number 22. Boiled potato with mustard smear. A whole boiled potato, split down the middle, smeared with a spoonful of plain yellow mustard instead of butter. It sounds strange until you taste it. The sharp tang cuts through the starch the same way butter would, but it costs almost nothing and keeps for months in a pantry without spoiling. Roadside diners and lunch counters across small American towns served versions of this to workers on tight budgets who needed something filling between shifts. The bite of the mustard against a soft, steaming potato wakes up your whole mouth in a way plain butter never quite manages. Most people today reach for sour cream or cheese without a second thought, never realizing the cheapest condiment in their fridge does the same job, sharper and with more character. Number 21. Depression mashers. No butter, no milk. No butter, no milk. Just potato water, the starchy liquid left behind after boiling, whipped back into the mash until it turns silky. People assume this tastes like punishment. It does not. The starch itself does the work butter usually gets credit for. Mash hard, mash hot, and do not apologize for what is missing because nothing is actually missing. This was Tuesday dinner across 1,000 kitchens that could not spare a stick of butter for vegetables. The texture comes out almost glossy if you whip it long enough, closer to a restaurant side dish than anyone expects from a recipe with 2 ingredients. Today, a tub of whipped potatoes at the store costs more than the potatoes themselves ever should. That gap did not happen by accident. Somebody decided convenience was worth charging extra for, and we paid it without asking why, year after year, without a single question. Number 20. Potato and onion hash, cast iron. Diced potato, sliced onion, a cast iron pan that has seen 40 years of breakfasts. That combination alone built an entire generation of Saturday mornings. The trick was never the ingredients. It was the patience to leave the potatoes alone long enough to form a crust instead of stirring them into mush every 30 seconds. Let them sit. Let them brown. Let the onions turn sweet and almost burnt at the edges because that edge is where the flavor lives. A grandfather who worked a factory floor all week could still make this in 15 minutes flat. No recipe card needed. It lived in his hands, not in a book. Today, we buy hash browns frozen in a bag and microwave them flat and pale, missing the entire point of the dish. Number 19. Baked potato with the bacon grease jar. Every kitchen once had one. A coffee can or a mason jar sitting by the stove, filled with strained bacon grease, used instead of butter for almost everything. A baked potato split open and dressed with a spoonful of that grease tastes richer than anything from a tub. Working-class kitchens ran on this jar for decades because nothing got poured down a drain that could still feed somebody, and that jar sat on the counter as a kind of quiet insurance against a thin week. The smell when that grease hits a hot potato is smoky and a little nostalgic, like a kitchen you have not stood in for years. We throw bacon fat away now without thinking twice. Your grandmother would call that one of the strangest decisions modern cooking ever made, and honestly, she might be right. Number 18. Potato soup, stretched with flour water. A thin paste of flour and water, whisked into broth, turned a watery potato soup into something that actually filled a stomach. Families with 6 mouths to feed and 1 pot of potatoes leaned on this trick constantly because stretching a meal was not optional, it was survival. The texture thickens slowly, almost silky, and nobody at the table could tell the difference between this and a soup made rich with cream. That was the whole point. A mother standing over that pot was not thinking about flavor first. She was thinking about how far one pot needed to go and whether everyone would actually feel full by the time the bowls were empty. Oral histories from farm families across the plains mention this exact method again and again, passed down because it worked every single time. A bowl of this soup was never fancy, but it meant nobody went to bed with an empty stomach that night. In 1936, the United States Department of Agriculture ran an entire public campaign convincing Americans the potato was not a poverty food. It was a survival food, and the difference mattered. A single pound cost almost nothing and carried enough calories to keep a grown man working a full day in a field. Posters went up in grocery stores and post offices across the country, making a case that no other vegetable could make as cheaply or as completely. Economists later calculated that pound for pound, nothing on a Depression-era table delivered more energy percent spent. That was not an accident. It was math, repeated in kitchen after kitchen, whether anyone called it math or not. Number 17. Scalloped potatoes. Without the cheese. Thin sliced potato layered with a simple flour and milk sauce, baked slow until the top turns golden and the edges crisp up against the dish. No cheese anywhere in it, because cheese was a luxury some weeks simply did not include. The sauce alone, peppered well, carries enough richness to make the whole dish feel indulgent, even though nothing in it cost much at all. Home cooks managing a household on a tight budget understood that richness came from technique, not from expensive ingredients, and they proved it weekly without ever needing to say so out loud. Layer it carefully, bake it patiently, and the potatoes themselves do the heavy lifting. Most recipes today assume cheese is mandatory. It never was. It was just one option among several, and not always the one a family could afford that week. Number 16. Potato and sauerkraut skillet. Sliced potato fried alongside a drained scoop of sauerkraut, finished with a little black pepper and nothing else. German immigrant communities across the Midwest carried this dish over generations, built from what their gardens and cellars actually produced through a long winter. The kraut turns soft and faintly sweet against the crisping potato, sour and starchy, in a combination that should not work as well as it does. This was never a dish built to impress outsiders. It fed families through cold months when fresh vegetables simply were not an option, using what had already been preserved instead of what was missing. Family history buffs tracing their roots back to farm towns in Ohio or Wisconsin often find this exact dish sitting quietly in an old relative's recipe box, barely changed in 100 years. Number 15. Potato pancakes from yesterday's leftovers. Leftover mashed potatoes never got thrown out. They got mixed with a beaten egg and a spoonful of flour, dropped into a hot pan, and pressed flat into crisp little cakes by morning. Nobody planned this meal in advance. It simply appeared whenever last night's dinner had anything left worth saving. The outside turns golden and almost crackling, while the inside stays soft and a little fluffy, somewhere between a pancake and a dumpling. Grandparents who lived through real shortages treated leftovers as a second meal hiding inside the first one, never as scraps. We have lost that instinct almost completely. Most leftover mashed potatoes today go straight into the trash within a day or two, which would have looked like madness to anyone cooking through the 1930s. Number 14. Salt potatoes, upstate New York style. Small new potatoes, boiled whole in water salty enough to float an egg, then finished with melted butter if you had it. This dish traveled with workers from salt mining towns in upstate New York and became a regional staple nobody outside the area has ever heard of. The salt forms a thin, almost crackling crust on the skin while the inside stays soft and slightly sweet, a texture that surprises anyone tasting it for the first time. For anyone with roots in that part of the country or family who left it behind for somewhere warmer, this dish carries the kind of specific, almost private nostalgia that only locals understand. It rarely appears on menus anywhere else, which makes finding it again feel less like cooking and more like remembering something you did not know you still had. Number 13. The four-meal potato. One single potato boiled whole on Monday. Tuesday, the leftover half gets fried in a pan. Wednesday, whatever remains turns into a thin soup with water and salt. Thursday, the last scraps go into the broth pot from number 24 and disappear into something else entirely. One potato, 4 nights, 0 waste. This was not a recipe so much as a survival schedule, the kind a grandchild only hears about secondhand and struggles to believe was ever truly necessary. It was. Families tracked food this carefully because they had no other choice, counting every piece the way some families today count dollars in a budget app, except nothing about it felt digital or distant, and somehow nobody at that table ever felt like they were suffering. They just called it making do, and making do worked. Number 12. Potato and powdered milk gravy. Powdered milk mixed back to liquid, thickened with a little flour and the starchy water from boiled potatoes. Pour it warm over a plate of mashed or sliced potatoes, and it stretches into something that tastes far richer than the ingredients suggest. Busy mothers raising a house full of kids leaned on this trick constantly because fresh milk spoiled fast, and a pantry tin of powder did not. And a tin sitting in the cupboard meant one less trip to town in a bad week. There was no time for anything complicated on a weeknight, with 5 mouths waiting at the table. This gravy came together in minutes and filled stomachs without draining a grocery budget already stretched thin. Most kitchens today have never opened a tin of powdered milk in their life, yet the version sold in stores costs more for less. Here is the part that should make you angry. A bag of potatoes costs next to nothing to grow. Farmers sell them for pennies a pound. Yet walk into any grocery store and a small tub of pre-made mashed potatoes costs more than the raw vegetable ever should. Sometimes 10 times more for a tub barely large enough to feed one person. That markup is not an accident. It is a business decision made by people who counted on you forgetting how cheap and how capable this vegetable always was. Your grandmother never forgot. Maybe it is time we stopped forgetting too. Before we keep going, tell me something in the comments. What is the moment you stood in a grocery store and felt genuinely robbed by a price tag? I want to hear the exact item. Drop it below, because we are nowhere near finished with this list. Number 11. Fried potato skins. Nothing wasted. When the inside of the potato went into a mash or a soup, the skins never followed it into the trash. Fried hot and fast in a little fat, they turn crisp and almost shatter when you bite down. Salty and satisfying in a way that costs almost nothing to make. This was never a restaurant appetizer loaded with cheese and bacon bits. It was simply what happened to the part most people consider garbage. Nothing with a use left in it got thrown away, full stop. Today, entire bags of potato skins get peeled off and binned without a second thought, treated as waste instead of as half the meal. That single habit alone would have horrified a grandmother who never wasted a scrap in her life. Number 10. Potato water bread starter. The cloudy water left over from boiling potatoes carries natural starch that yeast feeds on eagerly. Bakers used it for centuries to give bread a softer crumb and a longer shelf life, long before anyone called it a hack online. Save that water instead of pouring it down the drain, mix it into your dough, and the loaf rises taller with barely any extra effort. The smell, while it proofs, turns warm and slightly sweet, nothing like the flat scent of plain water dough, almost like the bread already knows it is going to turn out right. This trick lived quietly in farmhouse kitchens for generations, passed along without anyone writing it down, because writing it down never seemed necessary when everybody already knew. Number 9. Government cheese and potato bake. A block of government-issued cheese, sliced thick over a pan of sliced potatoes, baked until it turned bubbling and slightly browned at the edges. Families who relied on commodity food boxes in tough years built entire dinners around this single block of cheese because it was free and it was filling, and pride had nothing to do with using what you were given. The cheese melts heavy and a little salty, coating every slice of potato underneath in a way that makes the whole pan smell like something far more expensive than it was. Nobody apologized for this meal at the table, and nobody should now either. There is no shame folded into a dish that kept a family fed through a hard month. The only shame is forgetting how many people still need exactly this kind of meal today. Number 8. Potato and pinto bean skillet. Diced potato fried down with a can of pinto beans, a pinch of cumin if the pantry had it. Nothing fancy beyond that. This dish traveled north through families with roots across the Southwest. Built to stretch a small amount of meat or no meat at all across a full dinner. The beans turn creamy against the crisp potato edges, filling and warm in a way that costs only a few cents a serving even today. Grandmothers cooking for big families understood that protein did not have to come from meat to fill a plate properly. It just had to come from somewhere reliable and cheap. This skillet still feeds a table of 4 for less than a single fast food meal for one person alone. Number 7. Potato and canned milk chowder. Evaporated milk from a can, simmered with diced potato and a little salt, made a chowder rich enough to feel like a treat on a hard week. Canned milk did not spoil the way fresh milk did, which made it a pantry staple long before refrigerators were reliable in every home. For a senior cooking alone tonight, this is still 1 pot, 1 spoon, and almost no effort, the kind of dinner that does not demand much standing at a stove. The texture turns creamy and thick without ever needing real cream. Steam rising off a bowl of this on a cold evening still smells like comfort, the same way it did decades ago. Nothing about this dish needs updating. It only needs remembering. Number 6. Skillet potatoes with wild onion. Wild onion, foraged from a backyard or a roadside ditch, sliced thin and fried, alongside diced potato in whatever fat was on hand. This was not a recipe written down anywhere. It came from knowing your land, knowing what grew free for the picking, and never paying for something nature handed you. Working-class families with a patch of ground out back built entire meals around foraged greens nobody else thought to use, treating a weedy yard as a second pantry instead of just a lawn to mow. The smell of wild onion hitting a hot pan is sharper and more alive than anything from a grocery store bag. Most people today would not recognize wild onion if they stepped on it, let alone think to cook with it. Nutritionists studying Depression-era diets later confirmed something families already knew without a single study to back it up. A humble potato, skin included, carries enough vitamin and mineral content to anchor an entire diet almost on its own. Researchers crunching the numbers decades later kept landing on the same conclusion families had already lived out at their own tables. Science eventually caught up to instinct. The final entries on this list are not just recipes. They are the closest thing to a philosophy this whole countdown has been building toward, and they deserve your full attention. Number 5. The WPA-banned plain potato plate. A single boiled potato split open, dressed with nothing but salt. No butter, no cheese, no gravy from any of the entries above it. One government nutritionist working on a Depression-era cookbook actually pulled this entry before publication, calling it too plain to print, too honest about how little some families had left to work with. That rejection says more about pride than it ever did about the food itself, and it says something uncomfortable about who gets to decide what counts as a real meal. Eaten plain, a good potato still tastes earthy and slightly sweet, especially with the skin left on for texture. This was never a recipe meant to impress anyone. It was a recipe meant to keep someone alive, and that plate fed more families through hard winters than almost anything fancier ever did. Number 4. Potato and rendered fat biscuits. Rendered fat, saved from cooking meat across an entire week, worked into a simple biscuit dough alongside mashed potato folded in for moisture. The result bakes up dense, slightly savory, and nothing like the light, buttery biscuits sold today. Grandparents who lived through real scarcity treated rendered fat the way we treat butter now, as something precious, never something poured down a drain without a second thought. The smell while these bake fills a kitchen with something close to a roast dinner, even though no meat sits anywhere on the plate. A biscuit like this was never meant to be elegant. It was meant to use every last bit of what a family already had, and somehow it still tasted like something worth coming home to. Number 3. Potato and cornbread skillet supper. A layer of sliced potato topped with a thin cornbread batter, baked together in one cast iron skillet until the top turns golden and the bottom turns soft and almost custardy. Southern and rural kitchens built entire suppers around this single pan because it used a handful of pantry staples to feed a family without a trip to the store. The smell while it bakes is warm and slightly sweet, cornmeal and potato turning into something that feels far richer than its cost. Nobody needed a side dish next to this. The whole meal sat in one pan, one set of dishes, one less thing to worry about after a long day. That kind of simplicity built around real hunger has mostly disappeared from how we cook now. Number 2. The single potato supper. One potato, one person. One quiet evening that does not need to apologize for being simple. Boil it, mash it, butter it if you have butter, and eat it slow at a table set for one. Solo seniors living alone today often feel pressure to either cook a full spread or skip dinner entirely, as if there is no dignified middle ground between the two. There always was one. A grandmother eating alone in 1940 never treated a single potato as a lesser meal. She treated it as enough because it was enough, and because cooking for one has never meant cooking less carefully. The steam rising off one plate at one table still counts as a real dinner. It always did, and it still does now, whether anyone else is watching or not. Number 1. The potato eyes garden windowsill. Do not throw out a sprouting potato. Cut around the eyes, let the pieces dry for a day, and press them into a pot of soil on a windowsill that catches sun. Within weeks, green shoots push upward from something you almost threw in the trash. This is where the whole list has been heading. Every entry before this one stretched a potato further. This one regrows it entirely, for free, forever, from scraps most kitchens discard without a second thought. That single windowsill pot is not really about saving money anymore. It is about a kind of self-reliance that skips a generation when nobody passes it down. Grow one. Watch it. You will understand the rest of this list differently once you do. Pick 3 from this list and try them this week. Start with number 23, number 13, and number 1, because together they teach you everything else here without needing the whole countdown twice. I made the windowsill potato myself before writing this, half expecting nothing, and 3 weeks later had shoots taller than my hand sitting right there on the counter. Tell me below which entry your own grandparents actually made. By number, not just in general. Was it the chowder? Was it the hash? I want the exact number, not a vague memory. The potato was never really the point of any of this. Stretching what you have without an ounce of shame in it, that was always the real inheritance passed down quietly. One plain meal at a time, in kitchens that never once called themselves remarkable. Now you know what she knew.